Good morning. Can I welcome everybody to the 6th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2015, and can I remind everybody that all electronic devices should be switched off. Apologies have been received from Siobhan McMahon this morning. Our first item is for us to decide whether to take item 3, which is consideration of a work programme in private. Are members agreed? Agreed. That's agreed. Our next item is to complete our evidence taking on the British Sign Language Scotland Bill. This will be our final meeting for evidence taking, after which we will consider our Stage 1 report. We have received a large amount of information on the bill, as members will be aware, including around 150 submissions, many of which were in BSL. We've also received hundreds of comments and views of our BSL Facebook group, which now has, I'm reliably informed, over 2,000 members, so it's been a quite successful exercise. Can I thank everyone who took the time to give us their views and also their comments on the bill. I have to say that your comments are invaluable for the committee in determining our ability to scrutinise the legislation. So can I thank everybody who provided comments to us during our evidence gathering sessions. This morning, can I welcome Alistair Allen, Minister for Science, Learning and Scotland's Languages, and Hilary Third from the Equality Policy Unit in the Scottish Government. Welcome to you both. But before I invite questions from any members, I believe, Minister, you've got some opening remarks to make.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, they're brief, but I'd like to thank you for the invitation to speak to you this morning. I'm happy to talk through the Scottish Government's position on Mark Griffin's bill, which, as you know, the Government supports in principle. And I also welcome the opportunity to talk through some of the changes which I think improve it. But first, I hope you'll allow me just to say a few words about the fact that the Scottish Government recognises deafness as a culture and British Sign Language very much as a language. We formalised this in a statement of recognition in 2011. And if you'll permit me to digress a little bit, I just want to say that I personally am fascinated by the long cultural roots of sign language in Scotland. I was fascinated to learn that Joan, the daughter of King James I of Scotland, not King James I of Britain, who died in 1493, was deaf, and that she used some form of sign language at court, which was recognised officially and was provided with interpreters. So the reason I mention that is just to say that I recognise very much that we are talking about a culture with a long pedigree here. I hope we can have a positive discussion today about the benefits of supporting British Sign Language. Too often we talk about BSL users only as recipients of public services, and I want to pay tribute to the resilience and creativity of the deaf community in Scotland. I share the view expressed by some of the deaf witnesses who have given evidence to the committee that as a country we will benefit from their contribution and if we protect, promote and support and value their language and their culture. The committee has heard first-hand from BSL users in Scotland whose personal experience is often far from positive. As I understand witnesses have rightly pointed out, profoundly deaf people are covered by equality legislation and human rights conventions which do define their disability. But the evidence suggests that despite these legal protections, their needs are still not being met. People who are profoundly deaf are often marginalised and excluded because they do not have linguistic access to information, services or to the opportunities and benefits which many of the rest of us take for granted. So I appreciate that the current picture is mixed. The committee, I understand, has also seen and heard evidence of some truly excellent work that's going on to promote and support the use of BSL, and I applaud all of that. But I fear that these may be the exceptions rather than the norm, and I do recognise that there is a lot more that we can and must do across Scotland. As I've already said by way of conclusion, the Scottish Government supports the principles of the bill. As members will know, we have suggested some changes in the Government memorandum, and I'm delighted that Mark Griffin, in his earlier evidence session, indicated he is supportive of these, and we have been working with him to develop more detailed proposals. I believe these changes will simplify and streamline the requirements of the bill, which will have the effect of reducing any bureaucratic burden on public bodies, while at the same time making the legislation more action-orientated and outcome-focused. So I look forward to sharing more of the detail on our thinking on all of this, and look forward to hearing the committee's views.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm just going to go straight to questions, if you don't mind. I'm going to begin with George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I'd like to talk about promoting BSL, and a number of organisations and BSL users have said that the bill, there's two distinct reasons. Deaf people are not disabled, so disability legislation is not appropriate to meet their needs, and they need to help and preserve BSL as a language and a culture. Now, one of the things when we're talking about promoting, when I look at it, is I've been able to see the difference. I've been able to look at the practices within my own constituency office. How do I get training for my staff to, should a constituent come in? So that's the promotion from that point of view has made me look at how I deal with my business practices, because I've got staff going to go into training. But one of the things I'd like to ask, Minister, is whether the bill is sufficiently clear in what is intended by the idea of promotion, specifically who would be promoting BSL and how would we be doing that?
Well, those are all very reasonable questions. I think the important thing about the bill that Mr Griffin has provided and that we are seeking to amend is that it leaves, to some extent, the answers to those questions in the hands of the deaf community themselves, in that the advisory group that will be set up will very much determine the content of the national plan, and I hope will have some influence on bodies around the country as to what their priorities are. The priorities shouldn't be set by politicians, but there are examples of things that I can think of that we could do better, that I'm sure will feature in the national plan. They will be around wider public awareness of the existence of BSL, what it is, awareness of the fact that it is a language, it's not merely some means of signifying the English language. And also, I think it provides an opportunity for local authorities and others to think about what they can do to provide better services. It also, I think, allows us to think more generally about education. We have a great opportunity in the 1+2 programme that the government is promoting for modern languages in schools. It allows local authorities and others to think about where BSL fits into that.
Okay. You said, dear Minister, that obviously BSL is a language and it's recognised as such. Are there any lessons that we could possibly learn from the Gaelic Language Scotland Act? Are there any examples there?
Well, I know that Mr Griffin has looked at the 2005 Gaelic Language Act, and it's informed some of his thinking around this bill. As the Minister with responsibility for day-to-day running, if you like, of the 2005 Act for Gaelic, I can see the many benefits that there have been for the language in terms of a much more coordinated national approach to providing support to bodies which support the Gaelic language. I think perhaps the government amendments that are going to be forthcoming learn also from the experience that supporting a language is very importantly about plans, but it can't just be about plans. And as I say, are designed to try to ensure that we streamline the process as much as we can while keeping it effective.
Okay, thank you.
Can I push you a bit further, Minister, on the promotion? Now, I absolutely accept what you're saying about the deaf community taking the lead on many of these issues, and the group that's planned to, the advisory group that's planned to be set up. But in the bill, it's at 1.1a, the very first thing it says is the Scottish Ministers are to promote, etc., the use and understanding of the sign language known as British Sign Language. So clearly, there is a role for the Scottish Ministers to promote, not just to facilitate promotion of by others. So I'm wondering what, you said you have some thoughts, could you maybe expand on that and give us what your thoughts are in terms of the Scottish Minister's role in terms of your promotion of the BSL?
Well, I agree. Clearly, central government has a role, and that's why the national plan will be as I mentioned, informed by the deaf community, but the advisory group will advise ministers, and ministers will have to have a policy which they implement, and not only that they implement for the Scottish Government, but that will also apply to the very many bodies listed who are government bodies. So, for instance, that can involve promotion work to explain, as I mentioned, to the public the importance of BSL. It can involve at a symbolic level, but an important symbolic level, a recognition of the fact that BSL is a language. But it can also involve ensuring that our government bodies and our government keep constant track of what we're doing by way of promotion. It ensures that there is a mechanism by which we have to report back on action. I think, as I've mentioned, one or two examples. I think there's much more we could be doing and are doing in education, in schools. I think that there's much more that we can do and are doing to challenge all of our public bodies around the provision of services, and I hope that nationally ministers will be involved in all of that.
Liam MacArthur.
A brief follow-up. I mean, obviously the evidence we've taken has drawn a distinction at times between the deaf community and the deaf-blind community. Is there any observations you could make about whether or not the specific needs of the deaf-blind community would need to be kind of taken apart from that of the deaf community as a whole? How would that be reflected in any promotional work on behalf of either the Scottish Government or more widely amongst other public authorities?
Well, you're quite right to say that obviously the needs of the deaf-blind community are very distinctive for very obvious reasons. And while the numbers of people involved may be smaller, the needs that they have are very acute, very specific, and require one-to-one design, really. What I would say about where that fits with the bill is that I'm determined that the deaf-blind community will be represented directly on the advisory group. I accept that however this bill is implemented, it must take account of the views of that community. I don't know if you want to say any more, if I may, on that subject as well, Convener.
It's an important point. BSL, as the committee will appreciate, is a visual language, and deaf people who lose their sight will need a particular form of communication support so that they can continue to access the language. But as the Minister said, I think any approach needs to be proportionate. The numbers are very small and the needs can be different from one person to the next. So we'd be committed to working with Deafblind Scotland and others going forward to ensure that their needs are represented on the National Advisory Group and in the National Plan.
To suggest then that what will be referenced in the National Plan is likely to be very, very overarching and in a sense almost reflecting the fact that this would almost need to be individually specific in its nature.
I would definitely see the National Plan making explicit reference to the deaf-blind community, and the deaf-blind community would definitely be represented on the group.
Given you've just said that, Minister, does the bill itself need to reference in particular the deaf-blind community?
Well, as I say, I'm giving an undertaking here. As I've just indicated, my undertaking is that the deaf-blind community will be represented on the group, and there will be, as far as I'm concerned, it would be very remiss, I think, of anyone not to have explicit plans around the deaf-blind community mentioned in the group. Whether that needs to be on the face of the bill, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that we can put everything on the face of the bill, but I'm giving that commitment today.
Okay, thank you very much. Chick Brodie.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Minister. I want to may ask a question about the working group that was established, BSL and Linguistic Access Working Group. What has it actually achieved to date?
Well, my view is that it's achieved a great deal since, I think, 2000, when it was established. It was established by the then Scottish Executive, and I would certainly want to pay tribute to the work it's done. I don't think we would have reached the point we're at today, where we're talking about legislation giving status and rights to the British Sign Language community, had it not been for the work they'd done to raise awareness, had it not been for work that they did in 2009 around a roadmap which facilitated much of that. And as I say, I think they've brought us to a point where it's now possible to have legislation, so I would pay credit for that.
So why would we need to establish a National Advisory Board?
Well,
does this complement the work? Does it replace the work? I mean, what is the difference between, you just enunciated the achievements that the working group has delivered. So why would we create a National Advisory Board?
Well, I think one simple answer to that question would be that I would like to see a body which is much more substantially composed of deaf people, and not taking away from anything I've just said about the importance of the work of the previous group. I think it's important that any body that's at the heart of this new legislation should have a very substantial number of its, or proportion of its members who are actual day-to-day BSL users, who are deaf people, as I mentioned, also specifically having some kind of representation on behalf of deaf-blind people. And also this will have a very different, perhaps, function. It will be there to produce a national plan. Now, what that says about the previous group, well, that's for another day to discuss what the future, perhaps, of the previous group is. But this group has a specific function, and also, crucially, it should be composed in a specific way. Again, with the convener's permission, I don't know if Hilary Third wants to add anything to that.
So is there intention to keep both bodies going?
If I could maybe pick that up, as the Minister said, the group was set up by the Equality Unit in 2000, so it's been running for 15 years, and I think like any group it will have had its achievements, but there will be from time to time the need to review its function, its purpose and its work going forward. I think the National Advisory Group that we've proposed is developed to support the implementation of the bill will have very specific roles which are quite different from the BSL and Linguistic Access working group, and it's important that the right people are around the table. As the Minister said, strong representation from deaf BSL users, but also some of the public bodies who will be subject to the bill. So, for example, COSLA doesn't sit on the group at the moment, and I think it will be important that they're on the group that helps to inform the national plan. So I think that we feel it's important to create a group which absolutely fits the purpose for the implementation of the bill. It will be then for the BSL and Linguistic Access Working Group to consider what role it might have going forward, given that we will be in a very different context.
Okay, thank you. If I may, just you talk about the national plan, and it's instructive that we have friends here today in the audience. Will you have someone with technical expertise to sit on the national plan? It seems to me that for those that are not deaf, we have the use of call centres, for example, and we had at previous sessions discussions around the inability, if deaf people go into a surgery or they go into local authorities, that the communication link is difficult. And it would seem that there's absolutely no reason, if we set up the technology properly, that we can't guarantee communication at that level between various particular public bodies. So will you ensure that there's some technical expertise, technology expertise?
I think that's a very relevant point again, because I'm sure others like me have experience from their own constituencies of truly atrocious situations in terms of historically a lack of public services being available to the deaf community, of people who have been unable essentially to visit their doctors with any sense of privacy, people who have been unable to access, as you mentioned, anything that involves a call centre, as increasingly a lot of public services or private companies, I should say, do involve. People who have been left quite isolated, particularly if they're in rural communities where the the community of BSL unit users is very scattered. And there are technical solutions which have been made available. Indeed, the government has put quite a lot of money into, I'm going to get the name wrong here, but video streaming, Contact Scotland, which provides a number of these services online.
Okay, thank you.
As the Minister for Languages, I noted how Delphically you skipped around the issue of the membership of the advisory group. You'll be aware that some of the witnesses we've heard from are quite adamant that they see it as important that a majority of those on the advisory group are drawn from the deaf community. Is that something that you would be happy to consider, would support? Obviously, there are a range of different bodies who will need to be represented on that group, and it can't be kind of unmanageably large, but nevertheless it would seem to be an important principle to establish that the majority of the group is drawn from the deaf community.
I certainly wasn't intending to be Delphic or oracular or anything else. I think, as I gave an indication of, I'm open to all ideas as to what the composition of the group should be, but I certainly think that the composition of the group should be much more substantially composed of the deaf community than the previous group that we referred to earlier on. I'm perfectly open to the idea of a majority, but the points that you make yourself are also relevant, which is that we need to have a range of bodies represented, we need to have local authorities represented, we need to have service users represented. But yes, it should be in very substantial part, is all I can say at this stage, composed of deaf people.
Thank you.
Can I, Minister, just push you a little bit on this previous group, the linguistic, or not previous, current group, the Linguistic Access Working Group. One of its roles was to improve linguistic access for deaf people in Scotland and to raise awareness of deaf issues. At the very least, there's an overlap between that group and the group that you're suggesting, the National Advisory Group.
There may well be an overlap, and as we've talked about, it's for that group and for the government to consider in future whether that overlap would be sustainable or not. But I don't take the view that that group could be used to administer is probably the wrong word, but to deal with certainly a piece of legislation like this. I certainly don't think we would design a group that didn't have the numbers of deaf people and BSL users on it that it should do, nor I don't think could we use a group which didn't include local authorities who implement many of the services and would be dealing with many of the plans involved. Yeah. If you want to come in, if that's okay.
If I could just make a further point, the BSL and Linguistic Access Working Group, when it was set up, was looking at wider forms of deafness, not just at profoundly deaf people who use sign language. So it covered sensory impairment and hearing loss as well. So really it was set up in a different time and for a different purpose, and as the Minister says, doesn't have the representation of public bodies who would be subject to the bill. So I think it would be more difficult to redesign an existing group than to set up a new one with a good process in place to ensure that we have strong representation from deaf BSL users, and not only those that occupy professional roles, but community members as well.
I would accept that, but the counter-argument in a sense is it's not necessarily about effectively using the existing group to do the National Advisory Group's job, if you put it that way, but doesn't the new group that you're about to design effectively the National Advisory Group, can that not be the group that effectively does not only the role that you envisaged in relation to the bill, but also the work that's currently undertaken by the existing group? Yeah. Why do you need two groups?
Well, as I think we're both trying to indicate here, the access group is there. None of these groups exist forever. None of them are in statute. These are things we would have to review, but it doesn't get away from the reality that we do need a more formal group to deal with the statutory responsibilities that this bill would create. But yes, the government constantly does review the need for the number of groups it has. This would be one of the things we would have to review.
Okay,
if I may, would it be okay for...
Just one further point of clarification. The BSL and Linguistic Access Working Group is not a government group. It's not chaired by or owned by the government. And so it wouldn't really be for us to say that it shouldn't exist once we establish our own group. It was set up by the Government Equality Unit back in 2000, but we handed over the chairing to the Scottish Council on Deafness in 2011. So it wouldn't really be our place to say that that group should no longer exist once we establish the BSL National Advisory Group.
I'll bring you in 1 second, Chair. So the government set it up. Do you fund it?
We don't fund it.
Right.
We fund some of the organisations who are represented on it.
Right. Okay, sorry, Chair.
Yeah, it's just in terms of the creation of the working group. But in terms of promoting, and promoting strongly, as I think we all agree that has to be done, is there not a great danger of the dilution of that promotion by having certainly two fairly significant bodies? Wouldn't it be better to, push this through one particular body that represents the challenge that we have?
I mean, I don't want to go over old ground here too much, other than to say that this is a bill with very specific requirements on government. There needs to be a body set up to deal with the very specific requirements of this piece of legislation. As has been mentioned, the Access Group is not chaired by the government. That is a matter for another day. It's a matter we can certainly discuss. To some extent, it's not a matter for the government to dictate upon, but I'm very firmly of the view that the group we need has to be a group which is set up in a way that includes deaf people much more substantially than the other group you refer to.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, one final question before we move on, Minister, on this area. You just said that we need this group to be established effectively to advise on the bill, or words to that effect. If this group needs to be established in relation to the work of the bill, should it be on the face of the bill? Should the National Advisory Group be in the bill?
Well, my view is that the government is able to give undertakings about this. The committee can offer a view if they feel it needs to be on the face of the bill. My view is that it's not required. We've set out our thinking about the role of the group as a government. It's in the government's memorandum. And we don't feel it's necessary for it to be on the face of the bill for those reasons. The committee may take a different view.
Thank you very much. Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. I have heard what you've said to other members of the committee about the National Advisory Group and the roadmap, but so I'm not asking you to repeat what's already been said. But I'm actually struggling to understand what powers ministers already have to promote BSL. I'd like to understand what these powers have already achieved, let's say in the past 8 years since the government's been in power, and what powers the bill would bring forward that are not currently available. I'm just not seeing that clearly at the moment.
Well, probably some of the questions you have are probably ones you may want to address to the mover of the bill in some ways. I'm happy to answer as many of them as I can. Obviously, the government's role here, as we see it, is to improve a bill that's come from elsewhere. On your point about what the government has done so far without legislation or without specific legislation, the government has been working very hard to support BSL on a number of fronts. We've closely worked with, as has been mentioned, the BSL and Linguistic Access Group. There's also been funding in a number of areas to support the infrastructure for teaching and learning of BSL and to improve the engagement with the deaf community more widely. We've been, as I mentioned, enabling and encouraging schools to think about BSL as a subject alongside other modern languages. There's been funding to develop a pilot, online interpreting pilot for BSL users, particularly, as I alluded to, for people who want to access public services by phone. Again, at a symbolic level, in a ministerial statement in 2011, BSL was recognised as a language. So there are many things that we have been doing without this bill, but I would still take the view that the bill is helpful, and for that reason that the government's able to support its principles.
Okay, the question that you didn't answer is what would the bill provide in terms of specific powers that you don't already have? In other words, what could you do when this bill is passed that you're unable to do now?
I think one of the things that the bill allows that doesn't happen just now is it ensures that all public bodies, both national and local, have to think about BSL. They have to think about the existence of BSL and services in BSL. They have to make plans or produce statements about them as organisations. These may be organisations which haven't thought about this issue before. They'll have to think about it now. So that's a power that the bill creates that wasn't there before, and one that I think is helpful. Again, with the convener's permission, I don't know if Hilary wants to come in on that as well.
I think the... Okay. I think the most important point is the one that the Minister has made about requiring other public bodies to set out what they will do to improve access to BSL across their services. I think that's really the key point here. I think government has a very good record, actually, on promoting and supporting BSL. There are a number of very significant programmes of work that we've undertaken over the last few years. So I think we have a good record there, but the significant step really is about spreading that across the public sector, which will have a greater impact on deaf people across the country.
Well, the main policy objective in the bill, in the policy memorandum, is to require BSL plans to be prepared and published by Scottish ministers and listed public authorities. Now, you've said that you're working hard with BSL groups, you're engaging, enabling, funding, etc. And, you know, I want to do whatever is best to make BSL and access to BSL a success, but I'm actually struggling to, you know, requiring a plan to be prepared and, you know, talking to public bodies. I mean, can you not just say to them just now, can you prepare a plan once a year and let's see what you're doing? Do you need the bill to ask them to prepare and publish a plan?
Perhaps bodies around the country are more likely to listen to such a request if it's backed by legislation. But I think the point that you make around plans, I can answer that in perhaps two ways. Firstly, as has been mentioned, the 2005 Gaelic Act, although it deals with other areas such as the implementation of policy, the encouragement of public bodies to produce language plans has actually changed the behaviour of a number of public bodies in terms of provision around the Gaelic language. But the other thing I would say in response to your question about plans and is this what's required, is to say that we have worked with Mr Griffin and with COSLA and others to try to ensure that what we do on the plans front is proportionate. And I think it would be fair to say that we've all, I hope, together reached the same conclusion, which is that some of this should be streamlined. And I don't know if that's where your question comes from, but we do need to ensure that this isn't just about plans. And that's why, for instance, the number of plans within our amendments is greatly streamlined. There's a national plan. Indeed, other organisations may make statements about their activities, but we are not going down the route of having dozens upon dozens of individual plans for government bodies. Again, with your permission, I don't know if you want to say more about that.
This is actually thinking that's developed since the government memorandum was published, so it's useful to be able to spell it out for the committee. What we're suggesting is that rather than requiring all national listed authorities to produce their own plans, that we produce a single national plan which covers all national public bodies that are answerable to Scottish ministers. we think that this would allow us to take a much more strategic and coordinated approach in terms of the actions that need to happen at the national level. And it also reduces the number of plans that need to be produced and consulted on, therefore reducing the burden across the public sector. So we feel that this will be a better approach, both in terms of the quality or the outcome, but also the bureaucracy involved in producing such a plan. So I think that's quite an important change that we are proposing.
You see by the colour of my hair, I've sat here and passed quite a lot of legislation over since 1999, and it's not the plans or the legislation, but it's the implementation that really concerns me. So I'll just lump my wind-up questions together. So let's say one of your listed public authorities, after 5 years, they didn't take any actions, didn't do anything. So, you know, what happens then? What if people just give you nice warm words, cosy words in your national plan? We intend to make progress, which could be minimal or huge. But basically, what if they do nothing? What kind of sanctions have you got? What, you know, how do you make sure that this moves things forward? And can I just, given that you're also the Minister for Gaelic, and I'm a Highlands and Islands MSP, I mean, I just applaud the huge advances in Gaelic and the access to Gaelic, and, you know, it's just absolutely incredible. But Mark Griffin is on the record as saying he wants BSL on an equal footing with Gaelic. So could I maybe just ask for a piece of advice from you? What more needs to be done? Because this bill doesn't put BSL on an equal footing with Gaelic. In your opinion, what more needs to be done to get BSL on an equal footing with Gaelic? So only 2 questions. And the first one is, what if people ignore your national plan? What do you do then? And secondly, equality with Gaelic.
Okay. On the first point, obviously we're starting in terms of legislative status from quite a low base for BSL, to all of our shames. And I think that the emphasis in the bill as presented and as our proposed amendments take it is very much upon carrots rather than sticks. But it is relevant to say that bodies do have to provide some kind of statement as to regularly as to how they are progressing with measuring up, living up to the national plan. And there will be the opportunity, and I'm sure the community will take it, to offer an opinion if bodies are not living up to that. In terms of the point about the status of Gaelic, well, of course.
So if they say they're going to do something, and 1, 2 or 5 years later they haven't done anything, you will offer an opinion?
Well, they will have to provide statements as to whether or not they are living up to the principles of the national plan. And that, while I absolutely accept, is not legislative sanctions, perhaps of the kind that the member is talking about. It is nonetheless progress on where we are just now, where there's no requirement upon public bodies in any formal sense even to think about the language issues around BSL at all. On the second question around language status and comparisons with Gaelic, of course, at the moment, English doesn't have official status in Scotland. Scots has no defined status. Gaelic has some legal status through the 2005 Act. But the, if you like, official status of Scotland's indigenous languages is largely unresolved, I should say. The sympathies I have are very much around ensuring that all language communities make progress. I believe this bill, although it doesn't come from the government, ensures that progress is made with the status of BSL.
Okay, thank you. Just one point on the duties that Scottish ministers may have. Can I ask about there was a proposal effectively that a minister would have direct responsibility for BSL. The government's committed to do this, and I believe Mark Griffin has suggested at least that that provision could be deleted from the bill. I think that's my understanding of where the discussions went to. However, if that provision on ministerial responsibility for BSL was to be deleted, how would the link between BSL and a specific ministerial portfolio be guaranteed in the future?
Well, at the moment, obviously as Minister for Languages, I have the responsibility, and I think in any circumstances a minister would take lead responsibility on BSL. The reason I think my understanding is that there's certainly consensus on this point. The reason behind that is because the government, as you'll appreciate, operates on a basis of collective responsibility. We simply don't have on the whole legislation which on the face of legislation identifies the government's responsibility as sitting with a particular minister in the legislative formal sense. We have collective government responsibility, but that doesn't take away from the fact that as Minister for Languages I will be the person leading on this, and that will be the case in future governments, I'm sure.
Liam MacArthur?
Yeah, we're just about to come on to the issue of the, I think the financial memorandum and some of the implications that flow from that. But I was interested in the comment that was made by Mr. Dare about trying to streamline the process. And I think there has been obviously concerns about the amount of resources that are expended on the drawing up of plans and statements, etc., as opposed to the frontline delivery of services. But nevertheless, Minister, earlier in your comments you were saying, I think in response to Mary Scanlon, that where this takes us from where we are at the moment is it places a requirement on public authorities to produce a plan or a statement. But if I understood correctly from what Ms Third was saying, that in streamlining the process, in the sense they all come under an umbrella of a single plan, the ownership of that statement or that plan, if you like, would at the best be diluted, and in some senses you could see authorities saying, well, that's a national plan and really it doesn't have as much to do with us as a statement of intent, which would be very much drafted, owned, consulted on by the public authority or the relevant authority.
Let me be clear, when I'm talking about public bodies in that context that would come under the national plan, these would be national government bodies, so there is a connection there in the first place anyway. And there would be, there is a reasoning, I think, behind streamlining the bill in that way. Let me give you some examples. If we did have dozens upon dozens of consultation processes for dozens and dozens of government bodies around individual plans around BSL, I think we could very quickly get ourselves into a state of gridlock, given the pressures on relatively small deaf communities, given the lack of BSL interpreters. Obviously we want all these government bodies to be involved, but I personally don't think it makes sense for us to have, for some of the reasons I think possibly without putting words in our mouth Mary Scanlon was alluding to, I don't think we need to replicate the process endlessly.
I mean, I think that's fair, but I think it's also highly likely that the specific issues that the deaf community may have with different agencies of government are going to be different, whether in a nuanced sense or whether in a substantive sense, and therefore a national plan that is able to reflect that, so that whatever the organisation is has ownership of it, and indeed probably the priority of where the action points sit are slightly different for each of those organisations, need to be reflected. Otherwise it becomes a kind of homogenous plan that people can duck out of helping deliver, or play their part in delivering.
Well, these are reasonable observations, and for that reason the statements which will be provided by these government bodies or these public bodies will be flexible enough to take account of the fact that the plan may have to be interpreted in an entirely different way within, or to some extent a different way within Creative Scotland to within Skills Scotland, to pick examples, two examples of bodies which are not currently listed, which we'd like to see listed. I don't know if you are able to say any more about that.
Yeah, I think the other point is that our suggestion is that one of the first tasks for the BSL National Advisory Group would be to develop agreed national priorities. and to an extent they would determine what some of the actions would be for different national bodies, and then that would be reflected as part of the plan.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Leader. Minister, I'd like to carry on with this question of the plans, because it's a core feature of the bill that the requirement that Scottish ministers and the various listed authorities produce plans and consult on the drafts with BSL users and others. Now, the cost of how will public authorities meet the costs that would be contained within any recommendations that came up within these plans? Would they be expected to meet that out of their own resources?
Well, it should be said that some of the costings in circulation, for instance, the figure of 6 million over the 4-year period for the implementation of the bill, some of these costings refer to the bill. In fact, all these costings refer to the bill as presented, rather than the bill in the form that I would prefer to see it amended. I think some of what we can do along the lines that I've just mentioned about streamlining the number of plans does take us some way towards reducing some of the bureaucratic costs. And that's one of the areas that COSLA has been, I think, which has been a very positive, I think, conversation we've had with COSLA around some of that. But I do think that the issue of whether there are additional resources required to implement the bill, I mean, just to turn that on its head, obviously there are additional costs at a personal level and at a societal level, but also for local authorities if we don't get this right. I think one of the consequences of public bodies and local authorities not having to think in a more formal sense about services for deaf people is that deaf people are left behind in a way that creates a cost to society through the cost to them personally in terms of educational opportunities, the attainment gap that they face, the employment problems that they face. Again, I don't know if you want to come in on some of that.
I think, as the Minister says, some of our suggestions are designed to reduce the cost to the Scottish Government and its agencies, and also to local authorities, but our costings are based on the bill as published and not on the bill and our suggested amendments. So maybe that some further work needs to be done on that.
Thank you. Given that the plans are crucial, do you have any specific items that you would expect or want to see included in the national plan or the local plan?
Well, as I've indicated, I don't want to speak for the deaf community. They will speak, I hope, within the advisory group very clearly. But the kind of things that I can imagine being priorities, which I certainly think are priorities, are some of the things I've just mentioned. At a symbolic level, the recognition of the role and the importance and the linguistic status of BSL, and at a practical level, what we all do as public authorities to ensure that the opportunities for deaf people improve. Because I would certainly recognise that the opportunities for deaf people have not been what they should have been. That there is an attainment gap in our education system. I regularly meet deaf people who talk about the fact that they don't feel that their needs were considered fully by all of us as public authorities when it comes to promoting careers and jobs and the opportunity to gain qualifications for deaf people. I feel that there's much more that could be done in the wider community to recognise the role that BSL could play amongst non-deaf people in promoting understanding. These are all areas that I'm sure will be discussed, and all areas that I'm sure will be reflected in the advice that comes to me. But the advice is not a matter for me.
Clearly, the national plan will highlight the overarching priorities, and authorities that are participating in this will feed into that. Will there be sufficient flexibility that if there's a need on a local basis to deviate from the national priorities, given the fact that local circumstances can be different from area to area. Will that capability to deviate be included in the bill?
Yes, I think that some of the priorities set out in the national plan will, as you say, be less relevant to some local authorities, or listed authorities rather than others. And so, yes, there should be scope for them to determine how to respond to that. And it may be, for instance, that the National Advisory Group can offer advice to groups or bodies or authorities around the country, perhaps even almost templates, as to how their own statements could be put together. But definitely, as I've indicated, there has to be scope for those statements to reflect the actual function of those different bodies. They have to be flexible enough to do that, and they have to be flexible enough to realise that deaf people will engage with those authorities in completely different ways.
And just one last question. Should it be a requirement that the listed authorities are consulted on the national plan?
My understanding is from the government memorandum, and I'll refer here to Hilary Third, that there is reference to conversation between government and listed authorities around that. I don't know if you can add any more to that.
Yes, I think we would anticipate a very participatory process in developing the BSL national plan. It would need to involve, as we said, a wide range of interests that would be around the table at the BSL National Advisory Group, but also would need to reflect the views of the much wider community, both in terms of deaf people and a wider range of public bodies than can fit around that table. So I anticipate that quite a lot of our work in the first period after the bill has passed, once we've established the group, will be on engaging and consulting around the national plan. And clearly, if it covers a whole range of national bodies and has implications for local authorities and for health boards, we will need to ensure that they are content with and signed up with the agreed national priorities. And that's an important point that COSLA has made, that if it's going to be acceptable to and meaningful for local authorities, they will need to be part of the process of agreeing the national priorities. So I see a lot of engagement around the development of the plan, which is why we're suggesting a sort of post-government memorandum that perhaps the government needs to have longer to publish its first national plan than the year that's set out in the bill, because just the process of setting up the BSL National Advisory Group in the right way, I think, will take time, and it's very important that the first national plan is right and involves a wide range of interests. So that's something else that we would like to suggest.
Supplementary from Liam MacArthur.
I listened to what you were saying, Minister, about the costing estimates being a reflection of what was in the original, or what is in the original bill, and not necessarily what would emerge on the basis of what appear to be very constructive discussions between the government and Mark Griffin. I think this is my first members' bill scrutiny process, and I'm interested to observe that while financial memos that come before us with government bills tend to be an exercise in trying to reassure us that the costs are being kept to an absolute minimum, in this instance it looks like the kitchen sink has been rather thrown at it. And I note the costs to Scottish Government are estimated to be up to 140,000 a year in the first year and 100,000 thereafter. And I just wonder whether this falls into the same category as telling us that every parliamentary question costs however many hundreds of pounds, whereas actually these are answered by civil servants signed off by ministers, and we don't add to the number of civil servants just because we ask more parliamentary questions. So I appreciate these aren't necessarily the figures that will emerge in a finalised financial memorandum, but it would be helpful to get a better understanding quite where these figures emerge from, not least because in response to the question from Mary Scanlon earlier on, from the Scottish Government perspective, the bill's not requiring you or empowering you to do much beyond what you're already doing anyway, and it's more that the responsibility it places on other public authorities.
I'm not sure that's supplementary on the plans, and Gordon MacDonald was going to lead off on the financial.
I thought he was doing on the financial one.
So
this has all been prearranged.
No. Well, we do talk to each other, Minister. You're surprised to know.
You remember being a committee member, surely.
Anyway, I don't know whether you want to come in at this stage or do you want to wait till the...
Well, the only follow-up I would ask, bearing in mind that most of the aspects of the financial implications have been touched upon, is there any estimate of the cost of implementing the actions set out in the plans? Because it's all talking about the preparation of the plans, but there is doesn't seem to be any estimate of the cost of actually carrying out the actions set out in the plans. So is there an estimate?
No, there isn't. The figures that we're referring to here is that it is, as Mr MacArthur said, this is the government's estimates of the costs associated with the original bill as tabled, £6 million over 4 years. But no, it doesn't take us into the areas you're talking about. It's just the cost directly associated with the bill. I mean, for instance, my understanding is that the member hopes that the obligations under the bill will in practice lead to an increase to the services made available in terms of BSL by public authorities, but the financial memorandum doesn't attempt to quantify some of the things you're talking about, no.
And if there was to be increased services to BSL users on the back of this bill, it will require additional resources. So are there any additional resources coming from government in order to cover this?
Well, I mean, one of the conversations that we've had to have with COSLA, and that we've been very happy to have with COSLA, is around some of the issues of the role of local government in all this, as well as the role of national bodies. I come back to my point, and it's not meant to be evasive, but it's an important point. I come back to my point, which is that although this isn't the government's bill, we are supportive of its principles, and the reason, or one of the reasons that we're supportive of its principles, is because I think there is a false economy associated with not doing something for this group of people. That might sound like a general answer, but as I say, to be clear, the bill doesn't deal with or the bill's costings don't deal with implementation along the lines you've mentioned.
Thanks.
You okay, Gordon?
Yeah, I'm fine.
You okay, Liam?
I think in a sense, we've gone beyond the submission on the costings. Yeah. I was intrigued that the approach to the costings of the members' bill appeared to be a slightly different approach to the financial memorandum process for a government bill, and it'll be interesting whether, I mean, I don't know whether the government plans to come forward at a later stage with estimated costs, or whether the expectation would be that the proposer of the bill would be expected to do that. But it would certainly be interesting in that sense. We can ask them.
Okay. Chick Brodie.
Yes, just coming back to the national plan and the flexibility that appears to be being encouraged to its interpretation at a local level, on the basis that I abhor the notion of targets. Can you tell me what outcomes you expect the National Advisory Body to monitor, and how will they determine a meaningful performance review of progress and improved outcomes?
Well, for instance, when we have statements produced by local authorities, I don't think it would be appropriate for ministers to be in the business of monitoring, as it were, the
advisory body, which in these circumstances would have to be fairly robust.
Indeed, but what I'm saying is that, for instance, when it comes to when local authorities produce statements, it wouldn't be appropriate, is what I'm saying, for the National Advisory Body or the government to be monitoring, as it were, what the local authorities do. When it comes to national bodies, obviously there will be that connection with the government, and we would be wanting to see that their statements were robust. We'd be wanting to see that their statements showed that they wanted to live up to the national plan. I'm
sorry to interrupt, but I'm now confused, because there's a national plan which we want to achieve nationally. I know integral parts of that reside with the local authorities, but somewhere somebody has to make a review of a performance which ensures that we are improving outcomes.
Well, if Parliament, or indeed if the movers of the bill wanted to create a bill which gave powers and gave a mechanism for perhaps the kind of monitoring system or monitoring of progress system that the member has in mind, that would be an option for Parliament. But that's not what's in the bill. The bill is much more about encouragement, much more about carrots than about sticks. The original bill talks about performance review. The government's stance on that is that we would like to see that altered in some ways. Amendments will reflect that. Again, I might defer to yourself, Hilary, about some of the changes that are being proposed to the bill in that area.
Yeah, so as the Minister said, the bill as published requires Scottish ministers to publish a performance review, and that would include an account of the measures taken, outcomes attained, and highlight examples of best practice and poor performance. But as the Minister says, we're suggesting that we change that provision slightly, and that rather than talking about reviewing performance, we instead have a progress report, which might sound like just a change of language, but actually there's an important implication here. Firstly, it's very difficult to carry out a performance review in a situation where there is no baseline and there are no performance indicators in place to measure performance. Secondly, as the Minister's already said, we've heard from COSLA, who are strongly of the view that it's inappropriate for Scottish ministers to assess their performance and that they are instead accountable to their local communities. So for that reason, we've suggested that ministers should publish a progress report which sets out the national picture, gives a flavour of some of the activities that are taking place, but it would be different from a performance review because we accept that it's not appropriate for Scottish ministers to judge the performance of local authorities. However, we are thinking that over time it would be possible to build in an assessment of national impact, and also that each progress report would set out recommendations both at a national and at a local level for further improvements.
Sorry, can I just briefly, I don't accept it. I mean, yes, we don't have a baseline. That doesn't mean to say that we don't choose some time once, maybe in the bill, or as to when we say that we will determine by local authority just exactly what the baseline is and then measure the performance improvement against that. But at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to the people to influence the change in this particular area. And I'm surprised that if one local authority just doesn't pay any attention to but does not follow a national plan, who then ensures that they do follow?
The point there would be that local authorities democratically and publicly have to answer for their actions, but they do have to report on progress, as do national bodies. If they don't meet that, if they are clearly not living up to the principles of the national plan, if they're not able to report on substantial progress, then not only will they have to answer to that publicly, but they'll certainly have to answer to the deaf community for it.
Liam MacArthur, did you want?
I think Chick Brodie's just into my question on performance review, what I did to Gordon MacDonald on financial memorandum. He who lives by the sword, so to speak. Following up that point in relation to the performance review, the evidence we've had are that sort of expectations against centrally imposed targets isn't necessarily, or is of questionable value, and the democratic accountability point, the Minister, that you made, I think very fairly would be one I'd adhere to. But there does appear to be, at best, a patchy, but some may say a complete absence of data about performance in this area. So is there anything through this bill, or anything the government is committed to doing, that gives confidence that the data around performance across the kind of public realm can be monitored over a period, whatever the baseline is, so that the advisory group has something with which to presumably work?
Well, I think there is a lack of a baseline. I would hope that in time this bill would contribute to the gathering of better information about services around the country and services provided by public authorities, I would hope that over time that would lead to a culture of improvement.
From, again, we keep going back to the Gaelic Act in 2005. Is there anything from that experience and that process that would perhaps inform the way in which we try to chart the progress that's being made through this bill?
The Gaelic Act of 2005 is set up on a slightly different basis in that, for instance, implementation forms part of the legislation, and that the legislation set up a formal body, Bord na Gaelic, which, as well as having an implementation role, was actually involved in the funding of bodies. It was a different kind of beast in that respect. So I'm not sure you could make direct comparisons, no.
Right.
Again,
if I could just add, we have started to map local provision and need through a project that we funded over the last 2 years through Scottish Council on Deafness, the Equality and Access for Deaf People project, which has 3 project officers that have been working with public bodies and with local deaf communities to start to build the picture, and we will be building on that programme of work and supplementing that programme of work going forward, so that we will, I believe, during the course of the first cycle, develop a much better picture of provision and need.
I mean, it occurs to me as we're going through this in response to the earlier questions from Chick Brodie, that I think all the way along we've been conscious of the need to manage expectations about what this bill will do and what it won't do. Is there a risk in referring to a performance review that actually the perception of what will be achieved through this is likely to be very different from what actually public authorities and the advisory group are likely to be able to achieve through it?
Well, I suppose to some extent, this is why changes are being proposed by the government in this area, to make sure that there isn't a mismatch between the language of the bill and the reality, but also to make sure that there is a culture developed of bodies reporting back on actual progress against what they've set themselves as their priorities and what the national plan has set as priorities for them. So the aim of it is to become much more action focused. The aim is to ensure that bodies are setting themselves a to-do list of things that they can practically achieve, and that those things will be visible and understandable and can be commented on readily by the community.
Okay. Okay, can I just ask the Minister about the cycle for publishing BSL plans? I mean, clearly there's a process by which that's supposed to be done contained within the bill, and the government takes a different view on it. Could you maybe explain your reasoning for being opposed to the way that it's being proposed in the bill?
Well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, when we're talking about the timescales, the initial bill is talking about 5 years, and again that refers back, I suppose, or the inheritance that comes from is from the 2005 Gaelic Act. I'm not sure if I can use the analogy about the Forth Railway Bridge anymore, since they use stronger paint, but I think it would be fair to say that without taking away from the importance of Gaelic plans, that Bord na Gaelic, the whole body set up partly to administer these plans, finds that no sooner has it concluded and monitored a plan than it's returning to the same body's plan over again. So I'm not 100% convinced that 5 years is the right period. We suggested 7. I think it may end up being 6 in the government's eventual amendments. But the other thing to be said, and I'll ask Hilary to say more about this, is that the timescales in the original bill are all focused around the parliamentary cycle in quite a complex way, which I do think needs to be simplified to be workable.
Yeah. The advice from our solicitors is that the way that it's set out in the bill as published is quite complex, and that it would be more straightforward to set the timescale in terms of number of years. So in fact, I think the original proposal would have worked out even closer to 4 years, which, given that the experience of the Gaelic Act is that 5 years was really quite tight, that was the reason for suggesting the 7 years. I think it's important to note that that the expectation is that actions will be being taken between the period of the plan being published and the performance review or the progress report taking place. I think there's been some anxiety from some of the deaf witnesses that nothing happens between those periods, whereas our feeling is that that's where all the activity should happen, and we want to focus as much of the resource as possible on the actions rather than the reporting process. But as the Minister said, we've heard what many deaf witnesses have said and concerns about 7 years being too long, and so as the Minister said, we're thinking perhaps that the amendment should be for a 6-year cycle, but that within that that the government is allowed 2 years to develop the first national plan for the reasons that I outlined earlier.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got one final question, which is on the actual list of the bodies, which is Schedule 2, I think it is, yeah, in the bill. I just wondered on the government's view, first of all, whether or not there should be a list contained within the bill rather than separately. And secondly, if it was to be contained within the bill, at the moment it says that it can be amended by an order under subsection 3, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. So I just wondered whether or not you thought that was the appropriate level of procedure for any list contained in the bill to alter it. And as I say, my first question was on whether or not such a list should be contained on the face of the bill in the first place.
I think it's useful for a list of bodies to be there in the schedule, but I think it's useful for it to be something that's amendable by the process you've just described, rather than by the whole process of primary amendment or amendment to primary legislation by the long parliamentary route. But I think it is quite an important signal to set out that there should be a list of bodies, but we have amended the list of bodies, we have changed the list of bodies from that originally supplied in Mr Griffin's bill, because as I've mentioned, there are important ones that are left out in our view.
My second question though was really whether or not you agreed that it should be by the affirmative procedure, or do you think the negative is sufficient? Or
I think the affirmative procedure is proportionate if we were in the future seeking to amend the list of bodies, if a new body came into being, if a body went out of being. I think that's a proportionate way to try to amend it.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for your attendance this morning. We appreciate your time. We will be moving on to hear from the member in charge of the bill, Mark Griffin, now, so I'll suspend briefly. Can I welcome to the committee this morning Mark Griffin, who, although as a member of the committee, is here, of course, as a member in charge of the bill. Parliament, Joanna Hardy from the Non-Government Bills Unit, and Neil Ross, Principal Legal Officer. Welcome to both of you as well. Before we go to questions again, can I invite Mark
to come and give evidence to the committee. I've been following the evidence sessions, and I think the fantastic Facebook group that's been set up, and seen the massive quantity of evidence that's been submitted. I think that's been really encouraging. I'll just briefly set out that the reasons that I brought forward a British Sign Language bill are partly personal. I have two great grandparents who are deaf blind, and I was brought up hearing stories of how they raised their children and how they access services with that dual sensory impairment. And when I became an MSP and joined a cross-party group on deafness, disappointed really to hear the experiences of people in the cross-party group on deafness, almost 3 generations later, experiencing the same difficulties, having the same difficulties in access to services, the same difficulties with appreciation of the language and the culture of BSL, difficulties with accessing medical advice, the police service, difficulties with educational attainment that, again, still existed 3 generations later than the stories I was hearing about how my great grandparents lived their life. So that's really my motivation for bringing this bill in front of you today. I think there is an appetite for legislation through the consultation. There was an overwhelming appetite for legislation to give British Sign Language, to put British Sign Language on an equal footing, and not to say a legal footing, but certainly presentationally, and how Scotland treats its language, that BSL was put on a similar footing to the Gaelic Language Act, one of our other indigenous languages. And I think that's come over loud and clear, I think, in the evidence sessions from BSL users and the submissions through the Facebook page, that legislation really is required. At this stage, I'm in discussions with the government about their range of amendments, and I'm open to all of those coming forward, and we'll take a more detailed look at them when they're tabled, and I'm happy to take all the members' questions today.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mark. I'm going to move straight to George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mark. One of the main parts of the bill, one of the biggest issues that's come up, and one that the deaf community is interested in, is the fact that the promotion of BSL within the bill, the fact that it will be regarded as already is regarded as a language in its own right. But one of the main parts of the bill, and something that's always in my mind, is the fact that how I represent my own constituency. And I've already spoken to some of my staff about trying to get them to actually learn some rudimentary sign language as well, so we can represent our constituency. And what my question is, Mark, is how do you see the bill actually taking that a step further? Because it's obviously affected me, because I've seen the evidence, I've seen what's happened when we've been going through this. How do we ensure that other public organisations and other kind of bodies we promote the bill? How do you see that happening?
Yep. Obviously the promotion part, that's an obligation on the Scottish Minister, so that will be for the government to decide as to how they go about promotion of the language. But I think, reflecting on what you're saying, that's exactly what I hope will happen in the minds of decision makers and public authorities right across the country, that when they come to drafting their own statements or BSL plans, that they will actually go down the same thought process as yourself and think, how are we supposed to provide a service to our constituents, the taxpayers that rely on our services. How are we going to provide the same level of service that anyone else around the table expects and has a right to? So I think through those plans that will start the decision makers actually setting the ball in motion and continuing from the actions that you've described that you're going to be carrying out in your own constituency office.
So we're looking at a cultural change, looking at a way to move things forward from that. But what, we asked the Minister, obviously there's some mention of the Gaelic language bill and you've used it as a template almost. How do you see that learning from what's happened with that can help to make sure that things actually work from the get-go?
I mean, we heard from the Minister exactly how the Gaelic language had benefited, how the use of awareness of Gaelic had benefited from an act and a nationally coordinated language plan, that the use and understanding of and awareness of Gaelic had really increased, and that's I would hope that would also happen with BSL. Some of the lessons that have been learned from the Gaelic Language Act, the Minister and officials have been talking to me about how we go around amending the British Sign Language Bill to take into account the previous lessons learned on things like the length of cycle and other issues, that we can learn lessons from the Gaelic Language Act. That was really the sort of model that had built the BSL bill on, so obviously it makes sense that for people who have experience with that previous Language Act, that I would learn lessons and amend accordingly.
Thank you.
Mark, could you define what is intended by promotion?
I haven't defined what I mean as promotion. That has been left purely to Scottish ministers and the government of the day to decide what means, how much money they spend on promotion, how they do it. That's been left to ministers.
No, I realise you haven't defined it, and that's why I'm asking, because if the bill is passed as it stands, the Scottish ministers are to promote and they're to facilitate the promotion of the use and understanding of BSL. How will we recognise it? How will we know that they have actually undertaken their duties to a sufficient level if we're not got an equal understanding of what promotion is?
I think it will be up to the government of the day exactly how much money, how much resources they put into promotion of the bill. I've set out what I think should be done as a standard in terms of producing a national plan with a national set of national indicators, a national guidance as to what public bodies should do to comply with the plan to increase awareness and access to services in BSL. But it's going to be up to the government of the day as to what exactly they do. I'm going to push you again on this, because I think this is important. If the government of the day publishes its national plan, has that then met their duty to promote the language? In terms of the bill, they will have met the first part of their duty in producing a national plan, and also in promotion by identifying a minister with responsibility for British Sign Language. But that's not the end of the actions. There's then a performance review to make sure that the government themselves and public bodies haven't just produced a plan and then let it gather dust on a shelf, that they've actually, in their plans they have outcomes, timetables and a performance review which would pick those up at the end of the cycle to make sure that they've actually done what they said they would do.
I'm sorry, but I mean, is a performance review promotion? I wouldn't have thought so. I would have thought promotion was something different.
Yep, promotion is one of the obligations which the Minister will have to undertake. A performance review will come at the end to see whether they've met the standards that the government and public bodies have set themselves on promotion.
Chick.
Good morning. I'm confused. The intention of the bill, for which your action should be commended, is without question. But just following on from the previous question, we've already had, since the last 14 years, a working group that's been working with the Scottish Government to improve linguistic the access for deaf people. Now, we're now talking about the government a memorandum on the bill proposing a national advisory group. What promotion has there been? Now, if I put this in a business sense, forgive me, but if I have a marketing director, his job is to promote what I'm trying to sell, and then I have an operational director who has to make it happen. Can you tell me what drive has there been to promote, to market, to sell the BSL over the last 14 years, and how do you see the National Advisory Body complementing that, or indeed replacing it?
I mean, the government recognised BSL, officially recognised BSL in 2011 in terms of public announcements, public promotion of BSL in a big nationally coordinated way. I can't see anything else that has happened to boost it on that front. I think through the consultation that I carried out, that members of the BSL community felt that legislation was the way to go, that this was a big, bold statement by the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, if they were to support that they valued the British Sign Language as a language, as a culture, and that would go a way towards showing how valued and how supported it was, and then go on to further promote it. I think on the issue of the groups, I think we heard in the previous session that the BSL Linguistic Access Working Group was set up for a different purpose than this. It covered a whole spectrum of deafness, rather than the primary focus being on British Sign Language. It doesn't have the public bodies who would be expected to implement some of these plans, and so it's, in my initial thinking, I thought that that body could effectively be transplanted into an advisory group, and that would be a way of saving money, but in discussion and getting into the detail of how that national body would operate. I think the government are right to set up a new national advisory group. I think that's needed and is right to get the public bodies on that board who would be tasked with implementing some of the objectives set out in the national plan, for them to be properly involved and to have buy-in and a commitment to deliver on those objectives.
Okay, and I hear your point about saving money, but that, frankly, from a personal point of view at this moment in time, it's not about that. It's about creating a much wider awareness of what you're trying to achieve. In the last 14 years, technology has moved on hugely, and yet if we're looking for promotion of the wider cultural requirements, I'd have looked at how, when we talked about this with the Minister this morning, about we have call centres for those that are not deaf, and yet we've taken no steps in promotion of the deafness community in terms of making sure that technology is actually helping them, like we're using Skype or remote validation of questions that they may have of the public services. So why is it going to be what makes you think it's going to be different in terms of using that to promote, to sell the issue?
I mean, I think it's two separate things here. I mean, there have been uses of technology by the Scottish Government. They have used an online video interpreter service for NHS 24. That's been in operation for a while now, and they're now, the Scottish Government are now rolling that out to other public services. I think that has been promoted within the BSL community so that BSL users know that service exists. And that's about promoting a particular service that is of use to BSL users, to people who use BSL. What the bill is talking about as well is a wider promotion of BSL as a language and a culture, and that rather than promoting the availability of services as well, that we're promoting the value of BSL users as a culture to wider Scotland. I mean, the educational attainment issues, the underemployment issues that face BSL users, that face deaf people, that actually making sure that we value that community on an economic basis, on a cultural basis, is different, I think, from promoting an individual service which is focused purely on BSL.
I mean, promotion covers all spectrum, but I mean, this is where my confusion is. It comes back to the business of promotion and the bodies that promote it, and how and somebody will come back on how you review the performance. All of these things, we can say, right, we've promoted it, but at the end of the day, it's the outcomes that we're, improved outcomes that we're looking for.
Yeah, but I think that comes through improved promotion. If you're telling a health board or a public or a local authority that they...
So you use the word tell.
But if you're telling, I'm not saying that you're telling them what to do. If you're telling them or informing them about the issues facing a particular BSL user, issues related to educational attainment, about access to the jobs market, about mental health because of isolation. If you're informing a public body about those issues and the costs that are going to fall on those public bodies down the line in terms of increased benefit payments, increased access to medical services for mental health, that's a promotion of the issues around about BSL and the actions that public bodies will need to undertake to make sure that they get service delivery right, so that then down the line that you're actually saving money and reducing that burden later on. I think that's part of promotion as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just clear up one tiny point. In your earlier answer to Mr Brodie, you said that the bill says the ministers have to promote BSL and the culture. I'm not aware that anywhere in the face of the bill it says they have to promote the culture. It is just BSL.
Yep, sorry, it's to promote the use and understanding of the sign language known as British Sign Language. Yep, sorry.
So it's just for clarity. Okay, Liam MacArthur.
I mean, I think it's interesting on that, because I think we're all aware that there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law, and whatever we enact through this process, I think the expectation will be that it's approached in good faith, and presumably the intention is that over time promotion will mean very different things, whether through technological advances that allow us to do things in different ways, or because the baseline of where we're at is different, and therefore what is needed in terms of promoting it beyond that is different from what it was previously. Is that something that you see as reflecting the idea of not defining promotion too rigidly, but also a role for the National Advisory Committee, in a sense, to keep feet to the fire over successive years, and as the need for promotion may change and the opportunities for doing so may change?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We'll have a low baseline, and we're looking for continuous improvement, continuous promotion. That's why that it hasn't been prescriptive in terms of promotion, it hasn't been prescriptive in terms of what would be included in national plans, because, like you said, starting from a low baseline, there's a set of actions that government might wish to take us on to the next level, and then be a performance review, a reflection on what has worked and what hasn't worked, and then a revision and revision and revision as we go through the cycle of plans and reviews. So exactly, as you've set out. It's about giving that flexibility to review what exactly has gone on and reflect in the next cycle.
Presumably you'll be encouraged that even without that specific reference to promoting the culture of BSL, in his opening remarks to the committee this morning, the Minister made very specific proactive reference to the need to promote and recognise BSL both as its own language and with its own cultural identity as well. So in a sense the bill is already achieving some of that even before we've enacted it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the language and the culture themselves go hand in hand. And like I said, I did welcome the Minister's comments. The Government clearly have a very good appreciation and understanding of the BSL community and the culture of deaf and particularly deaf BSL users. So I welcome that. Yeah.
Yeah, and just finally on the issue again, it was raised. I raised it with the Minister this morning. Do you see the need to specifically refer to the needs of deaf-blind community within the bill, or is that something that maybe is better reflected in the national plan and more tailored arrangements for meeting their needs and their aspirations that sort of delivered through that route?
Yep. In drafting, when I talk about BSL or British Sign Language, that encompasses all users of British Sign Language, whether they are hearing, deaf, and deaf-blind. That's intended to cover all of it. But I know there are particular difficulties around people who are deaf and use British Sign Language and then go on to become blind as well. I'm in discussions with Deafblind Scotland as to whether there's a particular amendment that we can look at to bring that onto the face of the bill. But even if we don't manage to come up with an idea like that, I'm still reassured by the Minister and what he said about including making sure that deaf-blind people in particular were represented on the advisory body.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry to pick this up again, but you've just said that what you mean by BSL includes those who are deaf-blind. But again, there's no definition of that. I mean, that wasn't my understanding necessarily. I mean, it may well be what grows out of this and what happens, and maybe it'll be what public bodies do. But there's no definition of what BSL is in the bill. No.
There's no definition. It's the common use of signing. That's whether that's hands-on signing for deaf-blind people or how other deaf BSL users would interpret that as common.
Are you saying that those who are deaf-blind, what they're using is defined as BSL?
It's a form of British Sign Language.
Is it? Okay. Thank you. No, thank you for that. Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. Can I first of all pay credit to your motivation behind this bill? And I do understand that family background and family experience is one of the best motivations that any of us have. So well done for getting to this stage. Can I just ask you, Mark, I don't know if you heard the questioning to the Minister, but can you just explain briefly what will this bill provide that's not currently available?
Are you talking about in terms of services?
Yes, just what are we achieving with this bill that's not currently available?
There's currently no national plan for British Sign Language. Currently, public bodies aren't obliged to produce plans for how they deliver services to British Sign Language users. So, in terms of direct impact of this bill, that will be what is produced. But in the plans themselves, then obviously I would expect government, public bodies to set out exactly their priorities for how they would provide services, how they would promote British Sign Language within their own budgets and according to local needs.
Okay, what we've heard today is that local public authorities will not all be producing a plan. It will be one national plan that will take into account what local authorities would do. I'm just concerned that it doesn't become a tick box exercise and a bureaucratic exercise. You know, I want to satisfy myself that this bill will bring forward progress in terms of support and services for deaf people. So that really took me to the policy memorandum, paragraph 10. So in August 2009, we had the working group published a report, A Long and Winding Road, a Roadmap to British Sign Language and Linguistic Access. So we actually have a report, call it a report or call it a plan, but there are, in paragraph 11, 8 recommendations, which I won't read out. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But coincidentally, that was 6 years ago. So we have a report 6 years ago, which will be the time frame for your plan. I wonder if you can tell me how many of these 8 recommendations do you feel that progress has been made, or, you know, has this previous report been a success in terms of implementation?
I think the fact that I've got a bill and putting things on a statutory footing is really my answer. That I don't think, well, the body of work was excellent, the recommendations are excellent. If those recommendations had been implemented and improvement was being made in terms of support for families with deaf children, deaf attainment, public services being deaf and deafblind aware, if those recommendations were being met, I'd be more than happy with the progress and wouldn't see the need for this bill. Can I go back to the first point that you made, and it was maybe the discussion in the previous session. The Minister, I don't know whether it came across properly, but the Minister was just talking about bodies that were under the direct control of government and with ministerial direction, that they would subsume into the national plan, but public authorities, health boards, local authorities would still produce their own plans, even under the amended version proposed by government.
Okay, thank you for that. I was actually hoping that you would say that, because, you know, we've had this report in all good faith. The recommendations are excellent. It seems to cover a wide range of issues. Now, 6 years later, if you're saying the progress has been slow, if that's fair, how do we know that the plan that you're bringing forward 6 years later, we could be sitting here thinking, you know, in 2021, and we're saying, well, not much has happened there. So, you know, I asked the Minister, what if people just say, I'll make progress here, here, here and here, I'll do this, but they do nothing. So we've got another 6 years, if you like, wasted, with no further progress. And I'm really trying to get an answer as to, I'm not asking you to, you know, bring out sticks rather than carrots, but we've already had the carrot here and nothing's worked. So what is it about your bill that will ensure the deaf community, and I appreciate there's quite a few members in the audience today, and I'm sure they're looking for an assurance that this will be more meaningful in terms of services and support, but I'm not seeing how this can be guaranteed to make progress when what we have from 6 years ago hasn't made much progress.
Yep. I mean, that has been a standalone piece of work. What I'm proposing here is the national plan, where public bodies set out their priorities. That's included on the face of the bill, that so in section 3, subsection 4, subsection 3 and 4, where it sets out exactly what public bodies are expected to include in their plan, the outcomes, timescales, and then at the end of the sessions for those public bodies to provide a performance review on exactly where they are with the outcomes that they agreed in their own plans. So that's something that is an addition that the public themselves will have access to a performance review to be able to hold a public, if that's a local authority, to be able to hold their local authority to account. A minister will be able to hold a public body and that the Scottish Government have authority over as to why in their performance review they haven't met the ambitions and the aims of their plan that they had drafted 6 years earlier.
Well, it is my final point, Convener, but I do think there's quite a good analogy here, and that's the single outcome agreements in local authorities. Now, I've been concerned about care of the elderly, home care, mental health and various other issues in the Highlands. And I've looked at the single outcome agreements. I think it's about 4 to 6 inches deep. And what you find is, I'll give you an example, we will make progress on reducing class sizes. So maybe one school in Drumnadrochit has one class with one less pupil. That's progress. You know, and what I'm scared of, what I'm frightened of, is that, you know, we may be raising expectations, and I just want to make sure that these expectations are achieved. And I've seen too many recommendations that haven't been fulfilled. There's no sanctions. They will be offered an opinion. You know, well, I'm sorry, you've got another 6 years to make it better. Meantime, generations are losing out. I'm just wondering, perhaps I can ask, is there something that we could bring forward at stage 2 that would make these plans, the implementation of these plans, more successful, more robust and more user-friendly and more supportive to the deaf community?
I mean, there already is an amendment that the Government are proposing around consulting on public bodies' plans and consulting and translating into BSL that I think is a strengthening. But the main way of making sure that public bodies do what they say they'll do in public and their plans will be down to the deaf community scrutinising those plans, scrutinising the performance, and an element of naming and shaming and reputational risk to a public body of not carrying out the services that their functions in a way that...
The checks and balances are not with parliamentarians, but actually for the deaf community to come forward and name and shame. So,
well, there'd be a performance review. The authorities would review their own performance, feed that back into a national performance review, and the deaf community are able to lobby the minister, lobby their own, whether that's a local authority, lobby their own councillor. If that's a national body, lobby their MSP. That particular public body would be named and shamed, and I would hope that would be enough of a damage, the prospect of damage to a reputation, to make sure that they carried out the actions that they agreed and set themselves.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. At the core of this bill is the requirement for a national plan and also for listed authorities to produce a plan. Now, clearly these plans must have some aspiration within them, so there must be some cost attached to that. Will public authorities be expected to meet these demands?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't expect a public body to draft a plan with wildly ambitious promises to the deaf community that they couldn't deliver on. I would expect a public body to produce a plan that was costed and that they could meet within their own budget.
So the responsibility would be on the local authority?
Unless government may choose that a particular area needed national attention, national focus, and provide funding from central government on a particular area. But I would expect a public body, in sensibly managing their finances, to fully cost any plan that they produce.
I mean, the content of any plan that's produced is going to be vitally important towards achieving the objectives of the bill. What specific things would you anticipate or expect to see in the plan?
I mean, I've deliberately left that to government to be flexible, carrying on from the point that Liam MacArthur made, that progress will be ongoing and priorities will change. I've deliberately left that to the government to set out there what they are willing to prioritise, what they're willing to fund, and also I think the point the Minister made in the previous session was the one that I would rely on as well, that it's going to be up to the BSL community themselves to set out their own priorities for what should be in the national plan.
Do you have any expectations yourself? Is there anything that, that you would see at the front of your mind as being obvious content?
I mean, one of the obvious things to me would be attainment for deaf pupils and access to services for the BSL community in general. But like I say, they're my own interpretation, and you can be sure when it comes to consultation on the national plan that I will make my own submission.
Okay. Just one question in this area from myself, Mark, if you don't mind. I just wondered what your view was about the possibility of public authorities being allowed to deviate from the national plan.
I mean, the specific wording in the bill is for public bodies to try to achieve consistency. That's been specifically worded to give public bodies the flexibility to adapt to their own local circumstances. Obviously, you'll have the national plan. Parts of that will apply to local authorities, health boards, which won't apply to the police service or fire board. So I think it's right that there is a degree of flexibility, again, so that it's clear that a local authority is drafting their own plan with the needs of their own community in mind.
Do you think the bill is, as currently drafted, is sufficiently clear to allow deviation by a public authority from the national plan, or do you think further amendment is required?
I think the word in there to try to achieve consistency is clear. It's not an outright obligation to duplicate the findings. In particular, section 3.4.2, there's a line on that public bodies would have regarding drafting their plans for the potential for developing the use of British Sign Language in connection with the exercise of their own functions, which gives authorities to specifically tailor their plans to their own needs.
I think we'd all welcome the ability of public authorities because of the variation that you mentioned between bodies, their responsibilities, and of course just geography in different communities. So I accept that. But I'm just wondering whether the flip side of that, the question would be, do you believe it's firm enough? I mean, is try to achieve consistency sufficiently strong to ensure that we do get, at the very least, a base level of consistency across the country? I mean, if they come back and said, we did try, but we failed.
I mean, I think there'll be a set of recommendations in the national plan that will apply to all public bodies that they would be expected to meet as a minimum. As in one of the recommendations that was in the report that Mary Scanlon mentioned about staff being deaf and deafblind aware, in particular recommendations that would apply to all public bodies while leaving that flexibility to tailor their plans around particular services.
Okay, thank you very much. Liam MacArthur.
Following up on that, you may have heard Mark earlier on the exchange with the Minister in relation to trying to streamline the process of consultation and having a national plan that kind of sits above a range of public authorities. I was interested in the responses to the convener's questions there, where it would be tailored. Each public body would need to tailor a plan to reflect their circumstances, etc., and the needs of the deaf community in relation to the way they engage with that agency. But from what the Minister was suggesting, that there's potentially a risk there that if you have an overarching umbrella, there may be some sort of key principles and themes that emerge through that, but not necessarily the more nuanced or perhaps substantively different approach, because each of the authorities won't necessarily have either its own plan or its own statement. Is that something that you've been in discussion with the Minister about? Is it something you're comfortable with the government's suggested approach?
Yeah, I've been comfortable in principle with all of the government's amendments, and we've been in discussions just around the detail as to how we go about drafting those amendments, and whether, when we get down to the fine detail, whether they're acceptable in principle. I'm happy with the government's amendments that have been proposed so far.
Right. Okay. In terms of the performance review, you touched on it earlier on. I mean, I think from the outset we've been very conscious as a committee of the risk of expectations about what the bill will achieve exceeding what it is ever likely to achieve. And I think what's been encouraging is that the engagement, the evidence we've had from the deaf community suggests a high level of awareness and understanding of precisely what it is that the bill will do. But in terms of the performance review, again, from the exchange with the Minister, it's kind of unlike, perhaps, the type of performance review that organisations would be expected to adhere to. We don't have a great level of baseline data. So that process of data gathering is going to fall to each of the organisation, in a sense, be collected, centrally assessed by the National Advisory Group. How do you envisage that process taking place? I mean, is it ever likely to give us the sort of detailed picture of where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are? Or are we kind of feeling our way here? What's your take?
I mean, I think on your first point, I don't want to blow my own trumpet here, but it has been 4 years of careful expectation management with the BSL community, making sure that they knew that this bill wasn't simply waving a magic wand, that this was the first step in getting a cycle of continuous improvement, and I think that's been taken on board and recognised. I think the fact that we do have such poor baseline data is another motivation for me bringing this bill forward. I mean, we don't actually know how many BSL users there are in Scotland. It's a vague estimate based on census figures, and there's an issue with the census in that it's carried out in written English, which not all BSL users are able to complete and return. So that baseline information not being there is, like I said, one of the drivers for introducing the bill. What I hope will become the baseline is the first national plan and the first authority plan. That will then be the baseline. The objectives, the timescales that are in those first national and local plans then become the baseline to measure any performance review against.
I mean, do you see the importance of having essentially available statistics on how different authorities are performing, or is it more important that at a local or a regional level that what you have is a detailed picture of what's happening, and importantly probably what's not happening as well, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, I mean, I think both national and regional or local bodies need to have a picture of what their population is, so that they can plan their budgets, plan their services accordingly. And that's, I think, part of the feeling out there that the needs of that particular community haven't been fully identified, or we would know exactly how many deaf BSL users that there were in Scotland.
That challenge function from either from the deaf community itself or from National Advisory Group drill down into a local situation. I mean, there'll be areas of the country where the deaf community is well mobilised, perhaps as a result of the process leading up to this bill. That's formed to a greater extent. In other parts of the country, that may not be the case, and that therefore the pressure, the challenge function on local authorities and public bodies in those areas is not necessarily as intense, and as a result, the services that are available, the extent to which BSL is promoted and supported is less as a consequence. Is there do you see a national role for ensuring that there's some level of consistency across the country?
Yeah, I mean that is the issue, where areas in the central belt where there's that critical mass of BSL users who are able to challenge service providers, when in other more rural areas when there isn't that density, that some feel that they aren't able to collectively challenge on the services being provided. That's why the national review, I think, is needed, so that ourselves as representatives, whether that's the BDA, the Scottish Council on Deafness and other national bodies, are able to do the job that their members expect them to do and scrutinise national performance and performance of other public bodies. That performance review is critical to making sure that challenge is able to be made.
Right, okay.
Mary Scanlon, supplementary.
Just a very brief question, Mark. We've heard several times today from the Minister and from yourself that there is no baseline performance data on which to measure progress, and the official with the Minister said it would take at least 2 years to set up the first national plan because there's no baseline data. So in 2009, the Long and Winding Road, a roadmap to British Sign Language and linguistic access in Scotland, 8 recommendations were made. So really, if we've not got any baseline data now, presumably we didn't have any baseline data in 2009. Therefore, am I right in saying we've got no idea whether any of these 8 recommendations have been achieved, are being achieved, or even if we're making any progress? Is that fair? You're maybe not the right one to ask, but I thought your opinion may be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I can give you an example of this. When I first started working on this bill, and we tried to find out how many BSL users there were in Scotland, we got an estimate of around about 6,000, and those were the numbers that informed that previous document. And we had the latest census figures, which put it at about 12,000. So you've got a jump. You've got quite a jump, and just an indication of how difficult it's been to identify just how many BSL users there are in the country, and then the knock-on difficulties for providing services and providing a baseline, as you say.
But my point is that we cannot measure any progress, it seems to me, in the 2009 recommendations, because there were no baseline figures, so it would appear to me to be a fairly meaningless exercise. Or do you think that some progress, perhaps anecdotally if nothing else, has been made? My concern is that where we're going, we need to be much more robust going forward than where we've been in the past. And is this an example of a well-meaning report, but it's achieved nothing, maybe?
It does. The report does give strong recommendations. I think it's up to the government to answer to whether those recommendations have been fully implemented.
But if you don't know the baseline, you don't know where you're going. Yeah.
One supplementary, that's the third
Okay,
go at it.
sorry.
I'm going to move on because we've got other people who want to come in. Gordon.
Thanks very much. Mark, I want to ask you about the financial memorandum. In the original financial memorandum, you estimated that the cost would be roughly 20,000 to 30,000 per authority. COSLA's came back and said it should be roughly 40,000, and that's just for implementing the plans. Scottish Government has come in and said that over the 4-year period, as the bill currently stands, it would be about 6.1 million. Is it your intention, in light of discussions you've had with the Scottish Government, to update the financial memorandum?
Yep. I think if as a result of amendments that the costings associated with the bill substantially change, I think it's in standing orders that I have to provide an updated financial memorandum. So if that is the case, then that will be provided.
Right. And do you have a better handle on what the cost would be if the amendment to have, just say, one national plan would be?
I mean, there only ever would be one national plan, so... Yeah,
but how it's in, you know, if it's done on a regional basis where a lot of authorities sign up to whatever the regional element of that plan would be, have you got any estimate of what the cost would be?
We haven't done any work on any amendments. The financial memorandum provides the costs for the bill as it stands. We'd need to go away and do further work if there was a revised financial memorandum required.
Right. The bill, again, as it currently stands, does not include the cost of implementing the actions set out in the plans. And given that you obviously expect a level of promotion, even if it's just minimum, are you intending to estimate the potential cost of implementing the promotional activity within public authorities?
That will be for public bodies. They'll need to set their own priorities within their own budgets. The financial memorandum sets out exactly the cost impact of the bill itself. I'm not in a position to put an estimate on what a local authority or what a health board would choose to do.
Yeah, but you said in earlier answers that you expect a cycle of continuous improvement. Can you highlight what kinds of continuous improvement don't have cost implications?
There's no doubt that if a public body chooses to, say, a local authority chooses to provide BSL classes to parents of a deaf child, just 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So if a public authority, if a local authority decided to provide classes, then obviously there's going to be a cost associated with that. I've not done any work at all on the costings of a particular policy, because that's just one example. There could be a whole suite of improvements that a particular authority could choose to make, and I can't go into estimations of whatever those policies would cost on the basis that they may or may not include them in their plans.
Right. And my final question is, the bill as published doesn't include any requirement for plans to be produced in the BSL format, and the financial memorandum doesn't include the cost of publication in multiple formats. Should that omission be rectified in the bill itself, and should the financial memorandum be updated to reflect that?
I think this is basically because it's a private member's bill, and in the knowledge that the lowest cost available is most likely to be supported and passed by the government, and so with that in mind, that was omitted to keep costs as low as possible. The government have suggested that amendment, that all plans and consultations should be translated into BSL. That's fantastic. I'm happy that they're willing to propose that amendment to improve the bill.
Okay, thanks very much.
I'm a bit confused by that last answer. My understanding of financial memorandums are not to keep the cost as low as possible so that the Parliament will pass it and it's acceptable to the government. The purpose of financial memorandums are to estimate the proper costs to the public purse of a bill.
Sorry for any misunderstanding. I was talking about the bill itself being designed in such a way as the cost would be kept low. I'm not talking about artificially amending the financial memorandum to make that the cost as low as possible. I'm talking about the bill itself and the provisions within the bill being designed in such a way as to keep the cost as low as possible.
Okay, that helps clarify that a little bit. Just on the basis, though, of what you've just said. The bill itself, your estimated costs are 2.5, somewhere around about there. The government says it's 6 million. Now, that's based on your bill. Okay, it's not about exactly what's in the bill, but it's what will inevitably follow if the bill is passed. Yes?
Yeah, if the government amendments are passed and they're...
No, sorry, I'm not talking about the amendments. I'm talking about, for example, the translation services, the cost of translation. I mean, it's inconceivable, even though it's not in the bill that they have to translate everything into BSL, it's inconceivable that they would not do so. And therefore, although it's not in the bill, surely it's an absolutely obvious and inevitable cost of passing the bill.
Yep. If they were willing to do that, then and you'd expect they would be. So yes.
Well, I think that's why some of us are puzzled a little bit about the financial memorandum. What, of course, the Finance Committee have said, and your answers about the financial memorandum is what's based on what's in the bill, because clearly there are costs which the government have identified, which inevitably follow from the bill, even unamended bill, passing into law. Surely that should have been included in a financial memorandum. And I'm just wondering why it hasn't been.
I'll bring Joanna.
Please, yes.
It goes back to the scope and the ambition of a member's bill. They're not government bills, and they do have a different character, as Mark said. And secondly, Mark's responsibility under the standing orders is to bring forward a financial memorandum that costs everything that is on the face of the bill. And there was a debate during the development of the policy about whether bodies should be compelled to translate everything. And the decision came down on the side of not doing that at that point in time because of consideration of financial resources and availability of interpreters and translators and so on. And so for various interlinked policy reasons, it was decided that the bill would be silent on the question of translation, and the government have shown that they're willing and they believe that plans should be translated and consultation should take place using BSL, and Mark's very happy to welcome that, but it wasn't quite proper to envisage what kinds of costs might come on the back of the bill that weren't on the face of the bill and set those out in the financial memorandum. But it's always a slightly fine line, and that's the reason we ended up with the memorandum looking the way it does.
Well, obviously, I appreciate there's no compulsion to translate plans, etc. But I think it's almost a kind of, as night follows day, obvious that I cannot imagine that you wouldn't do so. That's why and I understand the point you're making about members' bills and the fine line there. But I'm just wondering if something is absolutely inevitable. It would seem to me that you should have put the stuff in.
I think Mark has many ambitions this bill could have been 10 times the length, but it had to be a starting point. It had to be realistic and achievable. And I disagree slightly that it's inevitable that consultation and translation, the BSL would be deployed for those. But you're right, it does fall very much into the highly likely, highly desirable category.
Okay, Liam?
Again, you will have heard me expressing a degree of interest in the approach to financial memoranda in relation to a member's bill compared to the government's bill, and there is a sense that the Scottish Government have rather thrown the kitchen sink at the costings of this bill in a way that with government bills we're invariably trying to tease out of them an impression as to whether or not these costs are at the upper end of what is likely, but to some extent obviously we're dealing with a bill here which may change quite substantially if the amendments that the government are proposing are taken on board. But some of the costings here, the Scottish Government are suggesting 140,000 in the first session of Scottish Government cost, 100,000 up to 100,000 in subsequent years. Do you have from the discussions with the Scottish Government, do you have a sense as to what those additional costs are? Because in response to questions from, I think it was Mary Scanlon, the Minister was suggesting that there wasn't a great deal that the bill was requiring of them that they aren't really already doing.
I haven't had any discussions with them in terms of discrepancies between the two cost estimates. It's purely been on the basis of amendments to the bill. The reason for that really has been that because of the level of costs associated with the bill, that the government will have to table a financial resolution, which a government minister will have to propose. So it was an assumption on my part that if they are supporting the bill, that they will have to table their own financial resolution and be supportive of the costs that will be incurred.
And presumably in relation to the financial memorandum, again, I think it was the Minister made clear that the estimates are in relation to the bill itself rather than any knock-on implications for service delivery. But it would be fair to say that one of the not just happy coincidences, but presumably one would hope the inevitable consequences of passing this sort of legislation is that issues in relation to allowing individuals to fulfil their full potential and all the rest of it don't come at a cost. Actually, they are a saving to the public purse across a range of different areas. Is that would be your assumption too?
Yep, exactly. You'd have hopefully an ambition realised where people wouldn't be underemployed, people would be achieving their full potential, earning accordingly, contributing to tax revenues, issues of isolation and the mental health issues associated that wouldn't be as prevalent and would be a lower burden on the NHS. So, yep, if this is done properly, then there should be savings to the public purse and increased taxation revenue.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to have to go back to the financial memorandum again. I've now had a chance to look at standing orders. And it seems to me that, and this is obviously what was concerning me in the back of my mind when you were discussing the financial memorandum. Standing orders say, a bill shall on introduction be accompanied by a financial memorandum which shall set out the best estimates of the administrative, compliance and other costs to which the provisions of the bill would give rise. Now that seems to me that the bill would give rise to these other costs that the government has identified and therefore should have been in the financial memorandum. Are you disagreeing with that? Is that not your interpretation of what the standing orders say?
I'll take that. I think what the government do in their memorandum is identify a number of desirables. They also set out some activity that's already taking place. And then they come up with a global figure which isn't necessarily at odds with what's in the financial memorandum. And I think also they've identified a number of areas where cost savings and efficiencies will be achievable through collective consultation and so on. And it's not until those amendments are properly drafted and explored and then recosted that we can ever hope to come up with a final figure. But I'm very satisfied that the financial memorandum did what it was supposed to do, and that is cost the provisions that are an absolute necessity under the bill. And that is the production of a national plan, the production of local plans, and a degree of consultation.
Well, my interpretation of the standing orders would have been that the phrase the bill would give rise would have covered the bits that are not.
I think one of the witnesses at the last session put it very succinctly when he said that what the bill is asking bodies to do is look at their resources and state within those resources what they will do to achieve the aims of the bill. And this has always had to be the starting point for a member's bill, because it isn't backed with, it's not a government aspiration at the moment, and it doesn't come with a budget behind it. Therefore, the bill was drafted in a way that compelled certain authorities and bodies to look to their budget, state what they're already doing, state what they could do, start to think about working together, and provide, if you like, a public record for what's being done and what's planned.
Sorry, Mark, did you want to add to that? Okay, thank you. Chick.
Yeah, in bringing this forward, I hear what you say. In bringing this forward, if I look at the paper that we have in terms of just taking one cost, the cost of the Scottish Government of supporting a national advisory group to support implementation of the bill, it's the same number every year. So there must, in terms of the computation, I mean, for example, supporting the development of the second BSL national plan is exactly the same as supporting the development of the first BSL national plan. Now, we must have learned something from the first BSL national plan to make a much more effective and productive development of the second national plan. And I don't know if there's inflation built in there or what prices. I mean, there has to be a supportive, meaningful supportive financial basis for the plan, for the bill.
In the financial memorandum, it set out where those costs come from in terms of time taken by a particular level of official, public body level. Right. We have set out a reduced cost for producing subsequent plans with the expectation that the bulk of the work would be done in the first plan. A performance review at the end of the cycle would then inform the production of subsequent plans, and so there would be a lower cost. So in the financial memorandum produced with the bill, there is that recognition that things would change at subsequent
I understand. I apologise. These were government numbers I was looking at, but even in discussion with the government, I should understand, the methodology that goes into all of this in terms of supporting the planned bill. I'll leave it there.
That's more of a comment. Just one final question, Mark, if you don't mind. It's the questions about the cycle for publishing BSL plans and the performance reviews. Obviously, there's the difference of opinion in terms of what you've originally published and what the Minister said today. I wonder if you can make comment on that and what your views are.
Yep. I mean, the reason that I had set out the timetable as it was, I think as I said at my previous appearance at committee, wasn't because of any knowledge of cycles of national plans or anything else. It was purely so that in the first year of office, a government would produce their plan, and in the final year of office, they would review their own performance, rather than having cycles overlapping different governments. And I thought that was the best way to go. Obviously, the Minister has extensive experience of the Gaelic Language Act, and if he has evidence that a longer cycle is better, then I'm happy to look at the detail of that evidence and open to that amendment.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate very much your attendance today, Mark, and your accompanying officials. Thank you very much. That indeed concludes our evidence taking at stage one. Our next step is to report our views on the bill to the Parliament, which will be followed by the stage one debate on the bill. Our website will provide information on the report and the debate when the information is available. So again, can I thank you very much. Next, we will consider an approach to a possible short inquiry into the educational attainment of school children with sensory impairments. We're going to move on to that now, but as we decided earlier on in the meeting that that will be in private, I'm going to now close the meeting to the public.